Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Just a warning, today's video contains spoilers for One Piece. Last week, as of this recording, Eiichiro Oda ended the Years of Grief in One Piece. That's not an official term for anything really, it's just how I think of the storylines that span from Water 7 to Marineford. These stories span about 260 chapters of the story or cover roughly 5.5 years of publication. They also represent a time when the Straw Hat Pirates run into tragedy after tragedy and have very little power to affect the outcome of it, which is pretty atypical for the story. The world of One Piece is a very hard and harsh world, but in general, the heroes have an ability to change it for the better, one they exercise to great effect very often. But for this short period of time, that was not the case. Now, the end of Marineford is the death of Portgas D, Luffy's sworn brother. Not a relation, just someone that he was very, very close to. Last week, I saw that the chapter Portgas D Dies was first published 14 years ago, and it got me thinking about this really kind of dark time in One Piece's history, and I began to ask myself, why would there be so many defeats chained together with so little change for the better in the larger world? I don't really follow the larger community that talk about this manga very closely, so I don't know if this has ever been discussed before, but I do have a few thoughts of my own that I wanted to talk about, because I think on the whole, this actually serves a very important storytelling purpose. And it's an important one to think about because I feel that a lot of modern storytelling, especially in this kind of young adult space or in comic books, is heavily influenced by what I call the Don Bluth method. Don Bluth is an animator who worked for Disney and eventually went independent and has made a number of very excellent films on his own. And he is credited with saying, you can show kids anything as long as the story has a happy ending. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but especially in these long-running formats for storytelling like comic books or manga, I think that lesson can be very hard to parse. Most stories of this kind have long story arcs with very low moments in them, but nevertheless end them on a high note. If you consider a story like Bleach or Naruto, which American audiences generally consider to be something of a unit with One Piece, the heroes in these stories generally find themselves in a number of difficult circumstances which will push them to their limits, but eventually they will find a solution, overcome their limits, and put the situation to right. There may be, at most, one major downer moment where a story arc ends with the heroes not winning, or where the heroes win at a cost that causes them some amount of grief. If you wanted a good example of each of these from, say, Naruto, a case of failure would be, of course, Sasuke's escape at the end of the first act, and an example of victory at great price would be Asuma Sensei's death in the Great Ninja War. Of course, the failure to stop Sasuke was eventually bought back at the end of the story, and while tragic, Asuma did leave a legacy for the ninjas of Konoha, so there is a certain amount of balance to that. The heavy subjects that One Piece gives us are similar in nature, but different in the way the story handles them. And I think there's an important lesson there that has to be parsed to tell the difference between what makes a good story and a really great one. Or at least a story that is closer to great. Consider Usopp's defection from the Straw Hat Pirates, which is the first of a series of very rapid emotional hits that come in Water 7. This is rooted in a very deep character flaw of Usopp, his need for his self-image to be validated by everyone, his insistence on being quote-unquote captain, even though he knows he is in a crew with a captain already. He puts his own needs and desires for how he sees himself above his friends and his allies, and it eventually tears him away from them. The persona of Captain Usopp is created to cover over his own deep insecurities, and those insecurities are brought out by the second great tragedy of Water 7, the loss of the Merry-Go. Merry was the Straw Hat's ship since pretty much the beginning of the story, and it was given to them by Usopp's closest friend in the world, at least at the time. Furthermore, Usopp was Merry's primary caretaker, and the fact that the ship was no longer seaworthy was a sign that his skills were not up to snuff, at least in his mind. although that was as much a projection of how inadequate he felt when it came time to help the Straw Hats in battle. This was a very nuanced set of tragedies that the Straw Hats had to deal with, and the problems came about as much because of their own lack of maturity than anything that someone did quote-unquote wrong. Yes, Usopp could have done a better job taking care of the ship, but a lot of the damage it took was just battle damage that can't be avoided when you're a pirate at sea, occasionally getting into fights. It was a self-inflicted injury and a reminder that, in the world of One Piece, as in our world, your mistakes will haunt you for a long time. And just because sometimes you change the world for the better, doesn't mean you always can. Now, the Water 7 saga and its follow-up, Thriller Bark, also contains some pretty major tragedies, but not tragedies in the present day, tragedies whose after effects we see throughout the story. I'm talking, of course, about the histories of Nico Robin and Brook, two people who had at least somewhat healthy support networks behind them, and yet lost them through no fault of their own. While all the Straw Hats have fairly tragic backstories, most of them get some chance to buy back at least part of what they lost. Nami loses Belle-Mère, but she eventually frees the rest of her village, and Nojiko and Mr. Genzo will live happy, healthy lives as a result of what she's done on their behalf. Chopper lost his first mentor, but he managed to complete his work and save Drum Island. However, for Robin, and to a lesser extent Brook, even if they carry forward the dreams their fallen comrades had, they're not going to get their friends back, or get to share anything with them again, even if they complete the great tasks before them. And having good friends now does not change the very many years they spent out in the cold with no one to help them. That's to say nothing about the annihilation of the Straw Hats at Sabaody Grove 12, the great Impel Down prison break, that ultimately freed more prisoners that hate Luffy than are willing to help him in the long run, or the heartbreaking and horrifying backstory of the Hancock sisters, a part of the story so dark that Oda doesn't even spell it out on the page. And that's all the things that happened before Marineford, a story that sees the death of Whitebeard, the strongest and one of the most admirable pirate captains in the world, and with Whitebeard, one of his adopted sons, Ace. By my count, from the time the Straw Hat Pirates arrive in Water 7 to the time Luffy goes into seclusion to train his haki, Luffy and company come out with wins 3 times. Against Cypher Pole 9, against Gecko Moria, and against Magellan, although technically that's Luffy on his own and not the Straw Hats as a crew. Each of those wins is tinged with tragedy. Mary's Viking funeral, the loss of Brook's crew, and the freeing of a number of pirate captains who are going to oppose Luffy in the future. On the other hand, the losses are almost constant. The Straw Hats have to run from a Buster Call, they're defeated by Bartholomew Kuma, not once, but twice. Bon Clay is found and lost again, ditto for Hachi, the crew is separated for over 2 years, and Ace ultimately dies in Luffy's arms. For 3 victories tinged with tragedy, they suffer 7 defeats, of varying intensities, admittedly, but still, it's more than a 2-to-1 ratio. That ain't great. And yet, looking back on that terrible stretch of 5 years, I've come to feel that you can't get away with taking them out. The world of One Piece is a world of good versus evil, but the sides are never clearly drawn. Even in the biggest and most obvious conflict between the Marines and the pirates, there's good guys and bad guys on both sides. And honestly, the good guys are pretty rare on both sides, too. The world of One Piece is also waiting for a hero that can unite them and bring them into a better age. That hero is first foreshadowed in Skypiea, just before Water 7, and he'll ultimately be revealed as the sun god Nika in Wano. But I don't think it's an accident that right after we learn that a sun god is coming to shed his light on a very dark world, we get a long stretch of story where we really see how dark the world can be. And that darkness doesn't just exist in the present moment, it has been building up for a long time. Furthermore, our heroes are not immune to it. They've all been touched by it in some way, and they're going to carry the scars of it, in some cases quite literally, for the rest of their lives. Now, ultimately, that means this story does have a happy ending, and I suppose that means you could say this does not disprove Don Bluth's rule about storytelling. You can show kids just about anything if it has a happy ending to it. What's interesting about One Piece is it doesn't have a happy ending yet. In fact, if you were in the target demo of 12 to 14 years old at the beginning of Water 7, by the time the end of Marineford came around, you would probably be an adult. Maybe if you started right at 12, you would still be younger than 18. But I'd say that's close enough to make no difference. Yet many of the story arcs that come in the Years of Grief are considered some of the best in the story. Except for Thriller Bark. Very few people will cite that as their favorite, even though I think it's better than most people remember it. And I think the reason for that is not what you usually hear. Many people will say it's great to see heroes build themselves back up, or that the contrast between the low points and the high points is what really make them shine out. And I actually don't disagree with that sentiment, but I think there's more to it than that. I think there's something in play that you can really see clearly in One Piece that you can't always in a story that plays out at a faster pace or over a shorter time scale. And that is the fact that these losses galvanize the Straw Hat crew. Usopp stops pretending to be a captain. He starts pretending to be something else, I acknowledge that, but he stops pretending to be a captain. He no longer puts his own self-image ahead of what is good for the group. He knows what happens when he does that. The Straw Hats bring on Frankie, an actual shipwright, who builds them a new ship to replace the one they lost, and keeps it in fighting trim, even when it does sustain some battle damage. The rubble of their previous defeats becomes not a springboard to reach for new heights, but a foundation for something a little more solid than what they had before. But it's also a reminder of how dark and how hard the world actually is, and why it is so important to put their best foot forward in changing it for the better. Even now, 14 years after the death of Portgas D Ace, the Years of Grief represent more than 20% of the overall story, and they're a stark reminder of how badly this dark world that the Straw Hats live in can beat up people who are just trying to put their best foot forward in making it a better place. Many people who evangelize this series talk about how big and how broad and how well lived in the world feels. But I don't think you could achieve that without having that constant reminder that, yes, it's big, it's broad, it's beautiful, it's alive. And part of being alive is dealing with suffering. Certainly not an element that has disappeared from the story, but it's also an element I look at a little bit differently in light of those 260 chapters there in the middle. Could I ever write something like that in a story of my own? I don't know. I don't know if I could write just one story for 25 plus years, but it's certainly a part of storytelling worth thinking about, and it is something I do think about from time to time. And I salute Oda for his skill and determination in bringing it about. That's all I got for you today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.